The armory antechamber smelled like ozone and metal, and the particular kind of exhaustion that only a 6-hour field exercise in full combat gear could produce. Thomas had been in the room exactly 11 seconds before he understood that something about this assignment was going to be different from hauling repair kits across the base, which was itself already different from anything he had done in the 23 years preceding his transfer to the joint human-Vilthari installation on the outer rim of the Cashin Belt. The attendants were gone. That was the first thing. The second thing was Princess Scarlet. She was standing in the center of the room with the particular stillness of someone who had made a conscious decision to be still, which is a different thing entirely from someone who is simply not moving. She was in full Vilthari combat armor. The articulated kind, dark alloy plates that caught the light in shifting geometric patterns, designed for a physique that was close to human and different in ways that the armor made architectural. It fit her like an argument. She was also visibly stuck, not dramatically stuck, not in distress stuck. She was stuck the way a very composed person is stuck when they have assessed the situation, found it beneath their dignity to struggle, and decided instead to simply wait for the universe to correct itself or send someone useful. Her red skin, deep and even in the way of her people, carried no particular embarrassment. Her long ears, the feature that most immediately distinguished Vilthari from humans at a distance, elegant and slightly angled, framed by dark hair that the field exercise had done nothing to improve, were held with the careful neutrality of someone who knew they were expressive and had opinions about that. She looked at him. He looked at her. He looked at the repair kit in his hands, which suddenly felt very small. "You're the technician," she said. It was not a question. It had the cadence of someone organizing available information into a workable plan, and he had apparently just been filed under solutions. "I was delivering this to the attendants," Thomas said, which was accurate and also, in the current context, completely unhelpful. "The attendants are dismissed." She said it simply, without elaboration, in the tone of someone who dismissed attendants regularly and did not feel that decisions made 3 hours ago required defense. The rear clasp on the upper dorsal plate jammed approximately 40 minutes into the return march. "I have been standing here for—" She consulted nothing, because the Vilthari had an internal sense of time that humans found either impressive or unsettling depending on their disposition. 172 minutes. Thomas did the arithmetic. He kept it off his face. "I was told to deliver the kit and return," he said. "Yes," said Scarlet, "and now you've delivered it. The second part is negotiable." He set down the kit. He was not entirely sure when he decided to do that. His hands had apparently reached a conclusion slightly ahead of the rest of him, and he chose to trust them, because they were holding the tools and seemed to understand the assignment better than he currently did. "Can I?" he started. "Yes," she said, which was efficient if slightly ahead of the question, and she turned with the practiced ease of someone in armor who had spent years learning to move in it, presenting the back plate and the offending clasp with the directness of someone who had stopped finding the situation awkward and moved through to practical. Thomas approached. He examined the clasp. The clasp was, to use a technical term, a disaster. It had been struck. He could see the impact scoring along the left edge, and the locking mechanism had torqued inward at an angle that was going to require the kind of careful, sustained attention that the repair kit was designed for, and that his hands were, fortunately, trained to provide. The problem was purely mechanical. He was very focused on the fact that the problem was purely mechanical. "This took a hit," he said. "A training drone malfunctioned in the final exercise segment," Scarlet said. "It was corrected." By me," she said, with the flatness of someone who considered that particular sentence self-evident. Thomas selected a tool. He leaned in to examine the clasp more carefully, and it was at this precise moment that the geometry of the situation introduced itself in full. To reach the clasp at the angle required, he needed to be close. Closer than the distance at which two people who had met 11 minutes ago would normally conduct business. The armor, ironically, was not helping. Its rear profile created a specific spatial problem that essentially required him to work from a position that he was going to describe to himself, firmly, as purely technical. He cleared his throat. "This might take a few minutes," he said. "I have been standing here for 172 minutes, Scarlet said. "I have already made peace with time." The first tool he tried was wrong. He discovered this not through any failure of training, but through the simple mechanical reality that the clasp had bent inward at an angle that the standard Velthari armor repair kit had, in its original design philosophy, apparently never anticipated, which was a reasonable oversight. Armor was not supposed to be struck by malfunctioning drones. The drone had not consulted the repair kit designers before making its decision. He switched tools. The second one was better. He applied pressure at the upper edge of the torqued locking pin with the careful patience of someone who understood that forcing the issue would make it worse. And that worse, in this particular context, had implications beyond the mechanical. "The kit you're using," Scarlet said, from approximately 4 inches in front of his face, "was designed for field repairs under combat conditions." "I'm aware," Thomas said, "which means it was designed to be used quickly." "Also aware that you are not using it quickly." "I'm using it correctly," he said, "which is a different priority than quickly, and in this specific case I'd argue the more important one." There was a pause. Her ears shifted slightly, just a degree, the kind of movement that was either involuntary or a very precise form of commentary. And then she said, "Acceptable," in the tone of someone granting a point they had not originally intended to grant. He worked. The locking pin was more deeply torqued than the exterior damage had suggested, which meant the impact had transferred force inward rather than dispersing it across the plate surface. Velthari combat armor was exceptional by any engineering standard. The alloy composition alone had been the subject of 3 separate human research papers in the past decade, all of them speculative because the Velthari had not provided the formula, and the researchers had been too polite to ask directly. The articulation systems were more sophisticated than anything the human military had fielded at equivalent weight. And yet here was a clasp, jammed, because a drone had hit it at the wrong angle on a day when the attendants had been dismissed, and a human technician had been sent with a kit designed for 3-handed operation. "Can I ask," Thomas said, because the silence had developed a texture that conversation would improve, "why the attendants were dismissed before the exercise concluded?" "They were dismissed after the exercise concluded," Scarlet said, "before the clasp became apparent. So you discovered the clasp was jammed, and then I assessed the situation and made a decision." Thomas considered this. The decision being that you preferred to wait alone rather than recall them. "The decision," she said, with the precise diction of someone selecting words the way a surgeon selects instruments, "was that the attendants had been standing for 6 hours, and the clasp was a mechanical problem rather than a ceremonial one, and there was no reason to extend their shift for something a technician could address." He stopped working for just a moment, not long enough to be notable. Then he resumed. "That was considerate." "It was logical," she said, and the slight stiffness in the word suggested that considerate had landed somewhere she hadn't prepared for, and she was rerouting around it with the efficiency of someone who had a great deal of practice redirecting conversations that were drifting toward the personal. The locking pin moved. Not much, a fraction of a millimeter, enough to tell him the approach was correct and that another 10 minutes of sustained, careful pressure was going to resolve the situation. He adjusted his grip on the tool and shifted his position slightly, which introduced a new geometric configuration that was, from a purely operational standpoint, necessary, and from every other standpoint something he was not going to think about. "The repair tools," he said, because talking was helping, "were definitely designed for someone with a different hand configuration than mine." "Velthari field technicians have longer fingers," Scarlet said. The grip radius on the kit, assumes an additional centimeter and a half of reach. That would explain a great deal about my last 20 minutes. You have been managing adequately. Adequately, he repeated. It was a compliment, she said, in the tone of someone who did not clarify that often and was noting the exception. He found himself smiling at the clasp, which could not see him and did not deserve the expression, but it went there anyway. There was something about her delivery, the precision of it, the dry economy, the way she dispensed words as though each one had been individually budgeted, that he was finding, against all professional better judgment, genuinely enjoyable. She was not what he had expected. He was not entirely sure what he had expected. The base briefings on Velthari royal protocol had been thorough and had somehow managed to communicate almost nothing true about what standing in a room with her was actually like. The briefings we received, he said, about Velthari, about protocol and interaction norms, were written by committee, Scarlett said, based on formal diplomatic encounter transcripts from first contact, which were themselves conducted by people who were very nervous and therefore very formal, and the result is documentation that describes an interaction style that does not exist in nature. Thomas laughed. It came out before he could make a decision about it. Her ears moved again, both of them, a small coordinated shift that was absolutely not a smile, but was adjacent to one in a way he suspected she would deny under questioning. The locking pin moved another ½ millimeter. He was getting there. The locking pin, Thomas had decided, was personal about this. It had been struck by a drone. It had bent inward at an angle that defied reasonable mechanical expectation, and it had apparently made a philosophical commitment to staying exactly where it was. He respected the consistency. He did not appreciate it. He switched his grip for the 4th time, angling the tool from below rather than above, and applied pressure with the slow deliberateness of someone who had stopped being in a hurry and started being in a negotiation. The armor's interior support structure gave him almost nothing to brace against from this approach, which meant the work was coming entirely from his wrist, which was going to have opinions about this tomorrow morning. You've changed your approach, Scarlett observed. The previous approach was optimistic, Thomas said. This one is realistic. Is there a difference in projected outcome? The outcome is the same. The timeline is more honest. She absorbed this with the stillness that he was beginning to understand was not indifference but something closer to attention. The way she processed information had a physical quality to it, a gathering, as though she was filing everything away in some internal architecture that was considerably more organized than his own. The Velthari cognitive research papers had touched on this, though again with the speculative hedging of people working from the outside. Standing here, close enough to be doing what he was doing, he thought the papers had undersold it. You were transferred here 4 months ago, she said. It was not a question, so he treated it like the statement it was. Yes, from the Meridian Station posting. You've read my file, he said, and managed to keep it neutral, which took some effort because there was something distinctly odd about having one's file read by the person whose armor you were currently attempting to dismantle. I read all files, she said. Personnel on joint installations operate in proximity to Velthari command staff. It is standard practice. Of course, Thomas said. Your technical scores are in the upper tier for your classification, she added, with the casualness of someone noting weather conditions. That's thank you. It was contextual, she said, not a compliment. You clarified the compliment again. I clarified the context, she said, and he could hear something in it, some precise and careful thing that was working very hard at a particular register and occasionally slipping. There is a difference. There really isn't, Thomas said, and applied pressure to the locking pin and felt it shift, genuinely shift, a real movement, a quarter turn of resistance giving way to something closer to possibility. He held the position, did not rush it. If he moved too quickly now, the pin would reseat in the same torqued position, and they would be back at the beginning, which was not an outcome he was going to allow after 40 minutes of careful work, and whatever this conversation was. Hold still, he said quietly. She held still. Completely, immediately, with the total physical discipline of someone whose body obeyed decisions without argument. It occurred to him that this was a person who had spent years in military training, who wore combat armor the way other people wore clothing, who had corrected a malfunctioning drone during a field exercise and described it in 4 words. The stillness was the same thing as the armor and the precision and the budgeted words. It was all the same thing. He worked the pin through the quarter turn and felt the locking mechanism begin to release its grip on the bent plate edge. Almost, he said. You've said that twice, Scarlett said, without moving anything except her mouth. The first time I was being optimistic, this time I'm being accurate. How do I know the difference? The first time I said it I immediately switched tools, Thomas said. This time I haven't moved. A pause, reasonable distinction. The base's environmental system cycled through its standard 20-minute atmospheric refresh at this point. He heard the familiar low hum of the circulation vents engaging, the barely perceptible shift in pressure that the human staff had long stopped noticing, and the Vilthari had never stopped noticing, because their sensory calibration was finer-tuned, in ways that the base architects had not fully accounted for when designing the shared facilities. Scarlett's ears tracked the sound for exactly 1 second before returning to their previous position. He noticed this because he was close enough to notice things he would not normally have data on, which was a category of situation his training had not specifically prepared him for. The atmospheric system, she said, cycles 4 minutes earlier than the posted schedule. Maintenance adjusted it last month, Thomas said. Something about pressure differential in the eastern corridor. No one updated the posted schedule. No one ever updates the posted schedule, he said. It's a known issue. There's a report about it. Has the report produced results? There's a follow-up report, Thomas said. And I believe a committee. Her ears moved. Both of them. The same small, coordinated shift as before, and this time he was at exactly the right angle to see that it extended slightly further than the previous instances, which he was not going to assign meaning to, except that he was absolutely assigning meaning to it, and there was nothing he could do about that now. The locking pin completed its turn. The clasp released. He felt it go, the clean mechanical give of something that had been wrong returning to right, the small, satisfying finality of a problem concluding. The upper dorsal plate shifted. The pressure redistribution moving through the armor's articulation points in a brief ripple of realigning components. He stepped back. Not quickly would have communicated something, but with the natural movement of someone whose work in a particular location was complete. There, he said. Scarlett rolled her shoulder, once slowly, testing the range of motion. Then she reached back with the ease of someone whose arms were accustomed to operating in full armor, and unlatched the upper dorsal plate herself with 3 practiced movements that made the entire last 40 minutes feel both completely necessary and slightly absurd. The repair is sound, she said. I know, Thomas said. She turned to look at him then, fully, in a way she hadn't quite done before or had done, but not like this, not with whatever had accumulated in the room over the past 40 minutes sitting in it alongside them. You know, she said, and it was not a challenge. It was something else. Something that was also not a compliment but was considerably less far from one than contextual information. He picked up his tools. He began returning them to the kit, with the careful attention of someone who was giving their hands something to do, while the rest of them caught up with the situation. He had the kit almost fully repacked when she spoke again. The dorsal plate will need a full workshop assessment before the next exercise rotation, she said. The impact scoring on the left edge suggests the alloy may have stress fractured beneath the surface. It won't be visible on standard inspection. Thomas looked up from the kit. I can flag it for the maintenance queue. The maintenance queue for Vilthari equipment currently has a 3-week backlog, Scarlett said. The next exercise rotation posts in 12 days. He considered this. I can flag it as priority. priority queue has a 9-day backlog. How do you know the exact queue times? I read those files as well, she said, without any particular emphasis, in the tone of someone for whom reading files was as routine as atmospheric cycling and considerably more useful. Thomas closed the repair kit. He set it on the workbench along the wall, which was the natural next step, and then he stayed at the workbench for a moment because it was a reasonable place to be, and also because the room had developed a quality he was having difficulty classifying. It was not uncomfortable. It was the opposite of uncomfortable, which was in some ways more difficult to navigate than discomfort would have been, because discomfort had clear protocols and this did not. I could look at it now, he said to the workbench, and then turned around because saying things to workbenches was not a behavior he wanted to establish. The plate. If you want to remove the rest of the armor, I can do a proper assessment before it goes into the queue. Flag it with accurate damage data instead of a standard intake report. Scarlett regarded him with the evaluating attention that he was learning to read as something other than scrutiny. On first encounter, it had felt like being measured. Now, 40-odd minutes into knowing her, it felt more like being considered. There was a distinction. He was not sure he could have explained it to anyone, but it was real. That would require additional time, she said. I'm not on another assignment until the end of shift, Thomas said. Which is, he checked, because unlike Vilthari he required external confirmation of time, 2 hours and 40 minutes. You checked, she said. I don't have an internal chronometer. No, she said, and something in it was almost warm, almost. It approached warmth from a careful distance and then maintained a professional radius. Humans don't. We make do, Thomas said. We invented clocks. We're very proud of them. Her ears moved. The further shift again, the one he had decided was laughter that had been through some kind of internal editing process before being permitted expression. He was collecting these the way someone might collect data points. Not intentionally, not with any structured purpose, simply because they kept occurring and he kept noticing, and there was nothing to be done about either of those facts. She reached up and began removing the armor with the efficient, systematic practice of someone who had done it 10,000 times. The chest plate first, the articulation releases along the sides, then the shoulder assemblies, each piece set down on the designated rack along the wall with the precision of someone for whom even this routine task was done correctly or not at all. He watched the process with the attention of someone who was, technically, here to assess a damaged plate, and who was also watching a person rather than a disassembly procedure, and who was being honest with himself about the difference. The damaged dorsal plate came off last. She held it out to him without ceremony, and he took it, turning it in his hands to examine the impact zone in the armory's direct lighting. She had been right. Beneath the surface scoring, running along the edge of the impact crater at an angle that would have been invisible on a standard visual inspection, there was a stress fracture line. Thin, clean, the kind of damage that looked like nothing until the next impact made it into something significant. You were right about the fracture, he said. I know, she said. He looked up. She was looking at him with the same expression he had seen after the clasp released, the one that was not a compliment but was aware of the territory. How did you know? He asked. You'd have needed to feel it through the armor during the exercise. The impact had a resonance quality that standard surface damage doesn't produce, she said. Vilthari armor communicates through the plate system. You feel the difference between a dent and a fracture if you know what you're listening for. The armor gives you haptic feedback. All Vilthari combat armor has integrated resonance transmission, she said. It was in the technical documentation provided to human installation staff at Joint Posting Orientation. I read the orientation documentation, Thomas said. Did you? I read most of the orientation documentation, he said. There were several hundred pages and some of it was the committee writing style, you understand. I wrote 3 of those sections, Scarlett said. Thomas looked at the fracture line in the plate. He examined it with great care. They were, he said, after a moment, clearly the best 3 sections. The silence that followed had a different quality than the silences before it. The earlier ones had been the silence of 2 people establishing the parameters of an unexpected situation. This one was easier. It had the quality of something that had stopped needing to be figured out and had started simply existing, which was a different and considerably more relaxed state of affairs. He carried the plate to the workbench and opened the repair kit again, extracting the diagnostic tool that could read stress fracture depth through alloy surfaces. It was one of the more sophisticated pieces in the kit, originally designed for hull assessment on smaller Velthari scout vessels, adapted for armor use in the 3rd generation of joint installation equipment. The adaptation had been, in his professional opinion, done well. He had said so in a maintenance report 8 weeks ago. The report was presumably in a queue somewhere, being read by no one. "This will take about 10 minutes, he said, positioning the diagnostic tool along the fracture line. The tool needs to pulse through the full depth of the alloy to give accurate measurements. Scarlett had moved to the bench along the opposite wall, not far. The room was not large, but a considered distance, and was watching him work with the focused calm of someone who did not experience waiting as an inconvenience, but as simply another form of being present. "You're comfortable with Velthari equipment," she said, "more than most human technicians at this installation." "I requested the additional certification when I transferred," Thomas said, keeping his attention on the diagnostic readout as the tool began its first pulse sequence. It seemed practical, given the posting. "Practical," she said, in precisely the tone he had used about her consideration for the attendants, returning it to him with the accuracy of someone who had very good aim. He felt the back of his neck do something warm and entirely unprofessional. He kept his eyes on the readout. "It was also interesting," he said. "The engineering, the resonance transmission system alone is— I spent about 3 weeks on just that section of the certification material." 3 weeks, Scarlett said. "It's a very good system," Thomas said. "Whoever designed it, the resonance transmission architecture was developed by the Velthari Institute of Applied Materials," she said, "in collaboration with the 3rd Velthari Imperial Engineering Corps." A pause. "I completed a research posting there before my military commission." Thomas looked up from the diagnostic tool. She was watching him with the expression that was not a compliment, that was adjacent to warmth, that maintained its professional radius and was doing so, he was increasingly certain, with deliberate effort rather than natural ease. "Of course you did," he said. Her ears moved completely. Both of them fully, the furthest he had seen them go, and this time there was no editing process. The sound that came with it was brief and real and entirely unguarded, and it lasted only a moment before she collected herself. But the moment had happened, and they both knew it had happened, and the room was very aware of it. He returned to the diagnostic readout. The first pulse sequence was completing. The fracture depth was reading at 4.3 millimeters, which was significant and confirmed her assessment, and meant the plate needed real workshop attention before it went back into service. 4.3 millimeters, he said, because the data was there and reporting it was the professional thing to do. "I estimated 4, she said. "You were close." "I was nearly correct," she said, "which is not the same thing. Most people would call that close." "Most people," Scarlett said, "are comfortable with approximations." She said it without judgment, the way someone states a characteristic of a landscape. "It is hilly, it is warm. Most people are comfortable with approximations." And he understood that he was being told something about her that she did not tell often, and that the telling was its own kind of thing. He began the second pulse sequence and did not say anything, because sometimes the right response to being told something real is to simply receive it without filling the space around it with words. The diagnostic tool completed its second pulse sequence with a soft chime that the kit's designers had clearly intended to be pleasant, and had achieved in the way that most intentionally pleasant sounds achieve it, adequately, without distinction. Thomas read the secondary depth measurement, cross-referenced it with the first, and confirmed what the initial reading had already told him. The fracture was clean, consistent, and needed professional workshop attention within the week. He wrote the numbers down on the intake form from the kit's side pocket, using the actual pen that lived there. Because the base's digital intake system had been experiencing synchronization issues with Velthari equipment records for the past 6 weeks, and there was a report about it, and presumably somewhere a committee. 4.3 on both sequences, he said. Consistent depth, no lateral spread. The fracture is stable for now, but the next significant impact will propagate it. Which is what I said, Scarlett said from the bench. Which is what you said, Thomas confirmed. Your estimate was off by 0.3 millimeters. I'm aware of what my estimate was. I'm just noting it for the record. There is no record, she said. You're writing on paper. The paper is the record, Thomas said, and heard her make a sound that was not quite the laugh from before but was in the same family, a short exhale with structure to it, controlled but present. He was building a taxonomy of these sounds without having decided to, and it was too late to stop now. He completed the intake form with the careful handwriting of someone who had learned early that maintenance documentation writ illegibly was maintenance documentation that got misread, which produced outcomes that were everyone's problem. Name of equipment, nature of damage, depth measurements, recommended action, estimated urgency. He signed his name at the bottom and set the pen down and looked at what he had written. I'll hand-deliver this to the workshop lead, he said, bypassing the queue entirely. If I submit it as a direct referral with diagnostic data attached, it gets assessed on its own merits rather than waiting for intake processing. Scarlett was quiet for a moment. That is not standard procedure. Standard procedure has a 9-day backlog, Thomas said. Your exercise rotation is in 12 days. Direct referral with diagnostic data typically turns around in 4 to 6. You know the workshop lead. I know everyone in maintenance, he said. It's a side effect of being the person who delivers the kits. You meet people. He paused. Also, I fixed her atmospheric calibration sensor 3 months ago when the official repair request was sitting in a queue. She remembers things like that. You have, Scarlett said, slowly, in the tone of someone assembling a picture from its component parts, developed an extensive informal network of reciprocal professional favors across this installation. I've been helpful to people, Thomas said. The network is a byproduct. It is a very useful byproduct. Most useful things are byproducts, he said. Intentional usefulness is rarer than people think. She considered this with the gathering attention that he had stopped finding unnerving and started finding something else. Something he was going to continue not naming for the foreseeable future, because naming things changed their state, and the current state was functioning well, and he saw no reason to introduce variables. He set the intake form beside the damaged plate, and began closing the repair kit for the second time that hour, which was 2 more times than he had expected to be doing it when he'd left the equipment bay with it 45 minutes ago. The kit's clasps were standard human specification, and closed with the satisfying snaps of things designed to be closed, which he appreciated after 40 minutes of negotiating with a mechanism designed to do the opposite. Can I ask you something? He said, and then did the thing where he continued without waiting for permission, because waiting for permission on a question was a grammatical construction that raised the tension of whatever followed, and the question did not require that. The drone, during the exercise, what actually happened? Scarlett was quiet for 2 seconds, which for her was a considered pause. It malfunctioned. You said that before. I'm asking what the malfunction looked like. Another pause, shorter. The drone's targeting calibration shifted mid-sequence. It began tracking heat signatures instead of the designated exercise markers. My armor's thermal profile was the highest in the immediate vicinity. So it targeted you specifically. It targeted the warmest object in its sensor range, she said. Which was me. which was not personal on the drone's part, as drones do not have the capacity for personal decisions, though I will admit the timing was inconvenient. "What did you do?" "I caught it," she said, with the simplicity of someone describing an ordinary thing that was not an ordinary thing at all. Thomas stopped with his hand on the kit's handle. "You caught a malfunctioning combat training drone." "It was a Mark 7 training unit," Scarlett said. 42 centimeters in diameter, approximately 8 kilograms. The approach vector gave me sufficient time to calculate the intercept. And then I overrode its power cell manually," she said, "which is why the dorsal plate has an impact score and a stress fracture rather than the alternative outcomes." Thomas thought about the alternative outcomes for a moment. "The alternative outcomes being considerably more interesting to write in a report," Scarlett said, "and considerably less preferable to experience." He laughed, fully this time, without the editorial process of deciding whether it was appropriate, and she watched him do it with the expression that had stopped maintaining quite such a careful professional radius. He noticed the distance had changed. Not physically, they were where they were, she on the bench, him at the workbench, the damaged plate between them, but in the way that distance is sometimes a quality of a room rather than a measurement of it, and the room's quality had shifted somewhere in the last hour without either of them having issued instructions to that effect. 8 kilograms, he said when he had finished laughing, moving at combat training velocity. The intercept required adjusting for the armor's momentum differential, she said. The dorsal plate absorbed most of the impact. It did its job. Except for the stress fracture, nothing performs perfectly under unexpected conditions, Scarlett said. Acceptable function within parameters is the realistic standard. You sound like an engineering manual. I spent time at the Institute of Applied Materials, she said. It leaves an impression. The armor performed acceptably, Thomas said. You caught a drone. I caught a drone, she agreed, with the flatness of someone who was going to continue being modest about this for as long as the conversation required it, and who found that commitment mildly inconvenient. And then stood here for 172 minutes, he said. 172 at the time of your arrival, she said. The current total is somewhat higher. He looked at his watch. He did a calculation. 2 hours and 19 minutes, he said. 2 hours 21, she said, without checking anything. Right, he said, the internal chronometer. It has its uses, she said. Do you know what time I arrived? 14:17 and 30 seconds, she said. Give or take 4 seconds. Velthari internal time sense has a margin of error. You have a margin of error, Thomas said. That's almost human of you. Her ears moved to the furthest position he had seen them reach, both simultaneously, the full unedited version. And this time, the sound that came with it was not brief, and it was not controlled, and it was the best thing he had heard since arriving at the Cashin Belt installation 4 months ago. And he thought he would probably be honest with himself about that for the rest of the evening, and dishonest with himself about it for several days after before arriving back at honesty through the long route. The repair kit was packed. The intake form was written. The plate was documented. Every task he had technically been here to perform was complete. He was aware of this. She was almost certainly aware of this. The room was aware of this. The question of what happened next was present in the air, alongside the ozone and the metal and the sound of the atmospheric system cycling 4 minutes ahead of its posted schedule. And nobody was in a rush to answer it. Thomas picked up the repair kit. It was the same kit he had picked up 4 hours ago in the equipment bay. The same weight, the same worn handle grip that had been worn by every technician who had carried it before him. And it was completely different in the way that objects become different after they have been present for something. He was aware that this was not a rational observation. He was also aware that it was true. I'll get this to the workshop lead tonight, he said. She runs a late shift on Thursdays. I'll catch her before she closes the intake log. Tonight is Thursday, Scarlett said. I know, Thomas said. That's why I said tonight. She was standing now, having moved from the bench at some point in the last few minutes with the quiet, natural ease of someone whose body made decisions efficiently. The armor was racked along the wall in its component pieces, each plate in its designated position, the damaged dorsal plate set slightly apart with his intake form folded and placed on top of it. The room looked orderly. It looked like a room in which a simple equipment delivery had occurred and been concluded. It did not look like what it actually was, which Thomas thought was either a quality of the room or of the hour, or of the particular way some things arrange themselves to appear unremarkable while being entirely the opposite. "The workshop lead," Scarlett said. "Her name is Una." Thomas looked at her. "You've read her file." "I've read everyone's file," she said, with the patience of someone who had already established this. "She transferred from the Outer Vega installation 14 months ago. Her technical rating in alloy stress assessment is the highest on this base." "I know," Thomas said. "That's why I'm going to her." "I know that you know," Scarlett said. "I was confirming that I know." He looked at her. She looked at him. The room, which had been doing a great deal of atmospheric work over the past 2 hours, continued its efforts. "That sentence," Thomas said carefully, "had a lot of knowing in it." "It was an efficient sentence," she said. "It was a very Vilthari sentence." "I am," she said, with the precise gravity of someone making an obvious point that is not actually obvious, Vilthari. He smiled. It was not the careful professional expression he had been managing since 1417 and 30 seconds. It was the real one. The one that had been making occasional unauthorized appearances throughout the afternoon, and had apparently decided that the situation no longer required authorization. She watched it happen with the expression that had long since stopped maintaining its radius, the one that existed in the territory between warmth and something more specific that neither of them had named and both of them knew. He moved toward the door. This was the natural next step. The kit was packed. The form was written. Una was waiting in a workshop on the eastern corridor, and there was a clear and logical path from this room to the next set of tasks. He had always been good at identifying the clear and logical path. It was part of why his technical scores were in the upper tier of his classification, which he was not going to think about again. He was 3 steps from the door when she said his name. Just his name. Nothing attached to it, no rank, no technician, no human in the specific form she sometimes used that managed to be both categorical and personal simultaneously. Just Thomas in her voice, with the economy of someone who had decided that his name contained everything the sentence required. He stopped. He turned. She was standing where she had been, and she had the look of someone who had made a decision with the same quiet efficiency she applied to everything, and was now simply waiting for the external world to catch up with the internal one. "The next exercise rotation," she said, "posts in 12 days. "You mentioned that," Thomas said. "The attendants," she continued, "are, in my assessment, frequently unreliable in their post-exercise availability." "You mentioned that too," he said, "in the summary." "I did not mention it," she said. "I am mentioning it now for the first time in this conversation." He considered pointing out that he had a very clear memory of the summary. He considered several things. He considered the intake form, and Una's late Thursday shift, and the 4 months he had spent on the Cashin Belt installation learning the maintenance queues and the atmospheric cycling schedules, and the informal network of reciprocal favors that was a byproduct of being useful, and the 6 hours she had spent in a field exercise catching drones with her hands, and then standing in a room alone for 172 minutes with the composed patience of someone who had long since made peace with time. He thought about the briefing documents, written by nervous committees from first contact transcripts, that had failed to communicate anything true about what standing in a room with her was actually like. He thought about the 3 weeks he had spent on resonance transmission architecture in the certification materials, and the way her ears moved when something got past the editing process, and the specific quality of the room's silence after she had laughed without intending to. He had always been good at the clear and logical path. He was also, it turned out, capable of recognizing when the clear and logical path and the true path were the same path, and this was one of those times. "I'll keep my schedule clear," he said. Something happened in her face, not the ears this time, though they moved as well, both of them, fully, but in the expression itself, in the composed precision of it, a brief and genuine softening that lasted only a moment before the architecture reasserted itself. The moment was enough. The moment was, in fact, precisely enough, and he thought that this was probably characteristic of her, that she would give exactly the amount and not more, and that the amount she gave would turn out to be exactly sufficient, and that understanding this about a person was its own kind of thing. "The diagnostic data is on the form," she said, returning to the professional register with the smoothness of someone who had decided the personal moment was complete and filed. "Una will need the second pulse sequence measurement specifically. Some workshop leads only use the first." "I'll make sure she reads both," Thomas said. "Good," said Scarlett. He turned back to the door. His hand found the release panel, standard Velthari installation hardware, which he had learned in the first week because the grip geometry was different from human standard, and it was the kind of thing that mattered when you were carrying equipment. The door opened with the soft pneumatic sound of Velthari engineering, which was better than human standard in the way that most Velthari engineering was better than human standard, efficiently, and without making a point of it. He stepped through. Behind him, in the armory antechamber that smelled of ozone and metal and 2 hours of something neither of them had named, he heard nothing. No movement, no words. She was doing the thing she did, the stillness that was attention rather than absence, and he understood that she was watching him leave with the same quality of focus she brought to everything, which was complete. He walked down the eastern corridor toward Una's workshop, the repair kit in his hand, the intake form folded in his pocket, his schedule clear for 12 days from now in the way that a thing is clear when it has been decided rather than merely left open. The atmospheric system cycled as he walked, 4 minutes ahead of the posted schedule, and somewhere behind him, in a room that looked like an ordinary room, a princess who caught drones with her hands and read every file and designed resonance transmission architecture, and distributed her words with the precision of someone who knew their exact value, stood in the particular silence of someone who had also, without making any significant outward demonstration of the fact, just had a good afternoon. Her ears did what they wanted. There was no one left in the room to see it, which meant there was also no one left to see her decide, after a moment, not to correct them.